I always say that I never sang any style of music that I hadn't heard in my household growing up. I can't approach it with any kind of authenticity.
At 78 years old, Linda Ronstadt cannot sing a single note. The voice that once filled stadiums, the voice that sold more records than almost any woman in rock history, has gone completely silent. Not because she chose to stop, because her own body took it from her. And for years, she kept the real reason hidden from the public, even as fans wondered why one of the greatest voices in American music had simply vanished from the stage. This is the true story of what happened to Linda Ronstadt, told through her own words, her own choices, and the career she built one honest risk at a time. Linda Ronstadt grew up in Tucson, Arizona, surrounded by music long before she ever set foot in a recording studio. Her family sang together at home, blending Mexican folk songs with American standards, and that mixture would end up shaping her entire career even though nobody could have predicted it at the time. She moved to Los Angeles as a teenager chasing a music career, and by the mid-1960s she had joined a folk rock trio called the Stone Ponies. Their song Different Drum became a hit in 1967, and it gave Ronstadt her first real taste of national attention. But she wanted more creative control than a trio format allowed, and she left to build a solo career, a decision that took real nerve for a young woman in an industry mostly run by men. The early 1970s were a defining stretch for her, not just because of the music she made but because of the musicians she gathered around her. In 1971, Ronstadt needed a backing band for a tour, and she assembled a group that included Glenn Frey, Don Henley, Randy Meisner, and Bernie Leadon. That collection of musicians would go on to form the Eagles, one of the best-selling rock bands in American history. Ronstadt's producer at the time, John Boylan, played a real role in connecting those musicians, and the touring experience they gained backing her gave them a foundation before they ever recorded as their own band. This part of the story is well documented and does not need embellishment. It is genuinely remarkable on its own that one artist's touring band became the seed of a band as massive as the Eagles, and Ronstadt has spoken about that period with pride rather than resentment over the years. Her solo career took off through the middle of the decade. Albums like Heart Like a Wheel, released in 1974, turned her into one of the top-selling artists in the country, male or female. Songs like You're No Good and Blue Bayou showed off a voice that could move between vulnerability and power in the same verse. By the late 70s, Ronstadt was one of the most commercially successful recording artists in America, competing with anyone on the charts regardless of genre. She had built that success through relentless touring and a work ethic that people who work with her have described consistently over the decades. What made Ronstadt unusual, even among her enormously talented peers, was her refusal to stay in one genre once she had mastered it. In the early 1980s, at the height of her pop and rock fame, she made a decision that stunned the music industry. She left rock behind to star in a Broadway and film production of The Pirates of Penzance, a Gilbert and Sullivan operetta that had nothing to do with the sound that made her famous. Critics and fans alike questioned the move. It was a financial risk and a reputational one, since a poor performance could have undone years of credibility. Instead, she earned strong reviews for her work in the production, proving she could hold her own in an entirely different discipline of singing. She did not stop there. In the mid-1980s, Ronstadt released a series of albums with orchestral arrangements by Nelson Riddle, revisiting the Great American Songbook, the kind of material associated with singers like Frank Sinatra rather than a rock and roll star. Albums like What's New sold millions of copies and introduced her to an entirely new audience that had no connection to her rock catalog. Then, in 1987, she released Canciones de Mi Padre, an album of traditional Mexican songs sung in Spanish, honoring the heritage she grew up with. It became the best-selling non-English language album in American recording history at the time, a genuinely historic achievement that reflected both commercial risk and deep personal meaning for her. Across 4 decades, Ronstadt kept collaborating with artists who matched her ambition rather than her comfort. She recorded with Dolly Parton and Emmylou Harris on the trio albums, blending 3 completely different vocal styles into some of the most beloved harmony recordings in country music. She worked with Aaron Neville on a series of duets that produced major hits in the late 1980s. These partnerships were built on mutual respect and genuine friendship, relationships that lasted for decades rather than ending in conflict. Emmylou Harris in particular remained a close friend of Ronstadt's for the rest of her career and beyond, visiting her long after Ronstadt stopped performing. By the late 1990s and into the 2000s, something started changing in Ronstadt's voice, though she did not understand it at the time. She has described noticing that her singing started to feel mechanically wrong, not simply a matter of nerves or aging. She would start a phrase and her voice would seem to lock up, freezing in a way that felt entirely different from ordinary vocal strain. Collaborators around her reassured her that nothing seemed wrong, suggesting it might be anxiety or the natural toll of decades of performing. But Ronstadt knew her own instrument better than anyone, and she sensed something deeper was happening even without a diagnosis to explain it. She kept performing through this uncertainty for years, pushing through shows even as her control over her own voice kept slipping. In 2009, she gave what would become her final public concert and stepped away from touring, though at that point she still did not have a name for what was happening to her. She spent the next several years working on a memoir called Simple Dreams, published in 2013, a project that forced her to confront her own history in detail for the first time. While finishing that book, her hands had started shaking noticeably enough that a friend urged her to see a neurologist. In December of 2012, she finally received an explanation. She had Parkinson's disease, a progressive neurological condition that affects movement and, in her case, had already taken away her ability to control her own vocal cords. She revealed the diagnosis publicly in August of 2013, just ahead of her memoir's release. In an interview with ARP, she explained that doctors believe the disease might have been triggered by tick bites she suffered back in the 1980s, since researchers have explored a possible link between certain infections and the neurodegeneration associated with Parkinson's. She said plainly that she could no longer sing a single note, something almost unthinkable for someone whose voice had defined her entire public identity. She also revealed that she had actually been unable to sing properly for the last 5 or 6 years she spent on stage, meaning she had been performing through a condition she did not yet understand, simply trying harder each night to force a voice that was no longer cooperating. The diagnosis reshaped her daily life in ways far beyond the loss of singing. Parkinson's affected her balance and mobility, and she eventually needed walking sticks on uneven ground and a wheelchair for travel. She later learned that her case had been reclassified as progressive supranuclear palsy, a related but more aggressive condition that shares symptoms with Parkinson's but often does not respond to the same treatments. She has said she falls into the group of patients who do not respond well to increased dopamine medication, which meant she eventually stopped relying on the standard treatment that helps many other patients manage their symptoms. Rather than disappearing entirely from public life, Ronstadt found a different way to stay connected to her audience and her own story. Starting in the mid-2010s, she began appearing at events called A Conversation with Linda, where she would sit on stage and talk through her career while old concert footage played, answering questions from the audience despite the physical difficulty of speaking for extended periods. She has said these appearances let her get out of the house, stay engaged with the world, and tell her own version of her history rather than leaving it to others to describe. In 2019, a documentary called Linda Ronstadt, The Sound of My Voice was released, walking through her career in her own words and reintroducing her remarkable range to audiences who may only have known 1 or 2 of her biggest hits. Recognition for her work continued even after she stopped performing. She received the National Medal of Arts in 2014, one of the highest honors the United States government gives to an artist, recognizing her lasting influence on American music. She was inducted into the Rock and Roll Hall of Fame that same year, though she chose not to attend the ceremony in person. She has also been honored by organizations supporting music education and Latino cultural preservation, reflecting the parts of her legacy tied to her Mexican heritage and her efforts to keep those musical traditions alive for younger generations. What stands out across Ronstadt's entire career, when you actually look at the documented record rather than rumor or speculation, is not a string of feuds with fellow musicians. It is a pattern of genuine risk-taking, of an artist willing to abandon commercial safety again and again in pursuit of something she found more meaningful. She left a hit trio to go solo. She left the top of the pop charts to sing operetta. She left rock and roll to sing standards with a big band orchestra. She left English-language music entirely to record an album in Spanish that became a historic commercial success. Each of those choices could have failed. Each one instead expanded what people believed a popular singer was allowed to do. Her relationships with the musicians she worked alongside, when documented honestly, mostly reflect collaboration rather than conflict. Her connection to the future members of the Eagles helped launch one of the most successful bands in rock history, and that origin story has never needed exaggeration to be impressive. Her decades-long friendships with artists like Emmylou Harris, Dolly Parton, and Aaron Neville produced some of the most celebrated recordings of their respective careers, built on genuine creative respect rather than rivalry. Even friends like Jackson Browne and Paul Simon remained close enough to visit her at home during the hardest years of her illness, offering support rather than distance. The loss of her voice remains, by her own account, one of the most painful parts of her life. She has spoken about the strange grief of losing the one thing that had always been there for her since childhood, the instrument she never had to think about until suddenly she could not use it at all. She has described understanding, only after her diagnosis, that no one can truly sing while living with Parkinson's disease, no matter how much effort or willpower they bring to it. That kind of honesty about limitation, delivered without self-pity, is part of what has made her story resonate with people far outside the music industry, including many who are living with their own versions of Parkinson's or other degenerative conditions. Today, Linda Ronstadt lives with the reality that her singing career is permanently over, but her influence on American music has not diminished with time. New generations of listeners keep discovering her catalog, moving from her rock hits into her operatic work, her standards albums, her Spanish-language recordings, and her collaborative work with other legendary voices. Her willingness to walk away from guaranteed success in pursuit of artistic growth, and later her willingness to speak honestly about an illness that took away the very thing that made her famous, together form a legacy built on courage rather than caution. She did not need manufactured feuds or dramatic betrayals to make her story compelling. The truth, on its own, has always been enough. If this look at Linda Ronstadt's real career and her journey with Parkinson's disease meant something to you, consider following for more honest, well-researched stories about the musicians who shaped American music history.